Welcome back to the channel on the road to 2000. So without wasting any time, let's get into the game. On this game, opponent started with the king's pawn opening, pawn to e4. Then I also played the king's pawn opening, pawn to e5. Then my opponent played knight to f3, attacking my king's pawn. Then I played knight to c6, protecting my king's pawn. Then my opponent played knight to c3. Now we're playing the 3 knights opening. Then I played knight to f6, and then we get into the 4 knights game. Then my opponent played pawn to d4, playing the Scotch variation. Then I took back with the pawn, or took with the pawn. Then my opponent took back with the knight. Then I played bishop to c5, attacking the knight on the center. Then my opponent took my knight. Then I took back with the pawn. Then my opponent played bishop to d3. Then I played pawn to d5, looking for an exchange of pawns. Then my opponent played pawn to e5, which is a mistake. The best move was to castle the king side. And then after that, I played knight to g5, attacking the f2 pawn. And also the f2 pawn is being attacked by the dark squared bishop. Then my opponent castles, which is a mistake this time, but earlier it wasn't a mistake because the knight was not on g4. Now it's a mistake because the knight is on g4. And then after my opponent castled, I played queen to h4, threatening checkmate. Then my opponent played pawn to h3. Then I captured the f2 pawn, which is the best move. Then my opponent played queen to f3, which is a mistake. I just feel like capturing with the rook and this position was the best move, because after I capture back with the queen, the king can move and then be in the safer square. So, but then my opponent played queen to f3. Then I played the best move, playing knight to capturing the pawn and h3 with the knight with the check. Then my opponent had to move and played knight to h2, one of the 2 squares that were the only options for the king. Then I played knight to g5 with a discovered attack, or with a discovered check. Then my opponent played queen to h3, which is a forced move. Of course, the king didn't have any other square to move to. Then I played knight to h3, capturing the queen. Now if the knight moves again, it's a mate, so my opponent has to protect the square. Then my opponent took back with the pawn. Then I took back with the queen. Then the game was over. It's just mate. So that's how the game ended. So that was the 4 knights game. Now let's get into another game that is a brilliant move. So let's get into it. Let's get into the next game. Now this game was also playing as black. My opponent started with the queen's pawn opening, pawn to d4. Then I played the Dutch defense with pawn to f5. And my opponent then played pawn to e3. Then I played knight to f6. Then my opponent played bishop to d3. Then I played the queen's pawn to d5. My opponent then played pawn to f4. Then I played pawn to e6, the king's pawn. My opponent then played pawn to h3, which is a mistake. And then I missed it, and then I played knight to c6. The best move here was to play knight to e4. This controls the g3 square and the f2 square. But then I missed it, and then I played knight to c6. My opponent then played pawn to c3. Then I played bishop to d6. My opponent then played queen to f3, which is a mistake. Then I played knight to e2. Then my opponent then played pawn to g3. Then I played bishop to e7. My opponent made another mistake by playing knight to d2, because this allows me to capture the pawn on g3, which is a brilliant move. Of course, my opponent cannot capture with the queen because this allows this. And capturing the pawn on g3 prevents the king from castling. So after I played bishop to h4, now there's a discovered check. So it's either the king moves or allows me to have an advantage of capturing another piece. But then my opponent moved the king, which is the best move. Then I played knight to e5, sorry, to e4. And then my opponent captured the knight, which is a mistake. I captured back with the pawn, which is the best move, and also attacking the queen. Then my opponent played queen to h5 with a check. Then I played pawn to g6, attacking the queen. Of course, the queen cannot capture the bishop. The bishop is protected by the queen, or by my queen. The queen played to... My opponent played the queen to h6. And then I played bishop to f6, protecting the square that's on g7 for the queen not to occupy the square. Then my opponent played knight to g2. Then I played bishop to d7. Then my opponent played the weirdest move. It's not, the computer doesn't analyze it as a blunder because black already has an advantage, but then in my eyes it's still a blunder. My opponent then captured the pawn on g6. Then of course I capture back with the pawn confidently because my rook is protected. Then my opponent captures the rook. Then I capture back with the bishop with the queen. Hence I said that was the weirdest sequence that I've ever seen. And the computer didn't analyze it as a blunder. But then we continue. Then my opponent played knight to e2. From here the game was just over. There's no way black can win. Black can win if I had made mistakes, but normally black wouldn't win this game. Then I played queen to h4. My opponent then played king to c5 to c2. Then I captured the free pawn. Then my opponent played knight to b3. Then I played queen to g2, pinning the knight to the king. And then my opponent moved closer to protect the knight. Then I played pawn to g5. Then my opponent played knight to c5. Then I castled the king side. Then my opponent played pawn to b4. And then I played pawn to f4, or capturing the pawn on f4. My opponent captures back with their own pawn. Then I just played queen to f2, and then my opponent played bishop to a3. Then I played knight to e7. Then my opponent captured the bishop. Then I captured back with the rook. Then my opponent played rook to h1, attacking my bishop. Then I played knight to g6, which is the best move, protecting my bishop. Then my opponent played pawn to b5. And then I played I played rook to d8, protecting my bishop. And then my opponent played king to d1 to avoid this. If my opponent had played another move, let's take my opponent played bishop to... I was just gonna capture this pawn, and now I'm winning the knight. I'm not really winning the knight because the rook can also claim me. So yeah, my opponent didn't wanna go through that. And then my opponent played king to d1. Then I played knight to f4 anyway. Then we went for this exchange. Then my opponent resigned here because the game is just over. There's no way my opponent can win. So that's how the game ended, with that one brilliant move that also gave me an advantage. But what really gave me an advantage was my opponent sacrificing the rook and the queen, which was very weird, given that my opponent is a 1600 rated player. So that's how the game played out. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe, like, comment, and until we see each other on the next video.